Hi again. Well, here we are with our final screencast about dramatic structure and trifles. We're gonna look at the point of attack and we're just gonna go through all the way the rest of the play. So, again, here's our flow chart. We have looked at the exposition and now we're just going to take a look at the point of attack. We're going to go through some of the rise in action up to the climax, down to the fall in action, and finally to the conclusion or just resolution. The point of attack or the inciting incident, remember this, is when the protagonist is just kick-started into action. The inciting incident can happen early or late in the overall story, so there is a difference between the story that the playwright takes a snapshot from and creates a plot for the play. In this case, a lot has happened before the action of the play begins. All the expositions we talked about in our class, the history of Mr. and Mrs. Wright, the murder, the fact they are all now going to the house to figure out the motive. That's all happened before the actual action for the protagonist begins. So, in Trifles, we need to figure out what is it. What action happened to kickstart the women on their journey? We have already said a lot of exposition had already taken place in the first part of the play. So I submit to you, the point at which the action is actually kick-started is when the counter-attorney asks Mrs. Peters to keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us. So, there's different ways in which the rise in action can be developed. First of all, the protagonist can find ways to solve or end the conflict. In this case, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters discovered clues, such as Mrs. Wright's messy home and uneven stitching on the quilt. Mrs. Hale fixes the stitching, but Mrs. Peters is concerned about they are tampering with evidence. Another way in which rise in action can develop in the antagonist or the opposing forces can set up plots to prevent conflict from being solved. So, one of the ones we just talked about in the class is how the men express a meaning attitude. In this case, I would just say it's when they have used words such as trifles and not much of the housekeeper and quilted or just nodded. The women become increasingly more resentful the more they see the demeaning attitude of the man. And I think that spurred them to become more determined to protect Mrs. Wright. Some other ways in which the opposing forces set up plots is, remember, we talked about how one opposing force is just that the women themselves are dealing with their own sense of what is right and what's wrong. So, they become increasingly aware of Mrs. Wright's problems as they discover the bird cage and the bird and its run neck. Then they begin to relate more sympathetically to her. They want to protect her more, yet they still struggle to maintain their own sense of duty, especially Mrs. Peters. Finally, we can tell we are just still in the rise in action phase, when the plot does not resolve to the conflict. So for some people, the finding of the bird with its run next seems to be the climax, but does that resolve the conflict? No, it does not. The action continues to rise after men return from the upstairs and to question the women about the bird cage. And the women, at this point, are still not sure about Mrs. Wright and what to reveal to the men. So, they talk themselves a little bit more into taking some of the blame for not seeing that she needed help. So, as the men leave, they continue to still struggle. Finally, the bird with a run neck could not be the climax. The moment in the play when the conflict is finally addressed, when the protagonist either succeeds or fails, but the conflict is ended. All moments of the play lead up to the conflict being resolved to the crisis happened, and often it's at the point of the most tension for the audience. So, think about all these four elements of the climax crisis. And here's what I think it happens. I think what happens is that men return from us stairs to check on the outside. At this point, the sheriff, Mr. Peters, who is Mrs. Peters' husband, said that, "Oh, don't worry about what Mrs. Peters is taken to Mrs. Wright. She is married to the law." The women finally make the decision to withhold the evidence of the bird. We see this as they struggle to hide the books, and finally the books is hidden, just in time. So this is the point at which the audience want to know what's gonna happen. Here is where the climax happens. The moment of decision has come. Will they reveal the evidence or not? Will they reveal the evidence? They look at each other and agree to hide the evidence. They struggle to hide the books that contain the bird and they just barely get it done in time. So here's where it happens. After that day, Nemo, or the fallen action, this illustrated by the moments after the climax of the play where the plot just resolves itself, where loose ends are tied up, and the storylines, other than the main plot, if they are ended. In Trifles, the end comes very quickly in this short play. The men enter after the women have hidden successfully the box. They enter and speak degradingly to the women. Well, Henry, at least we just found out that she was not going to quote it. Why you call it ladies? And the final line of the play, Mrs. Hale says, we call